Good afternoon, everyone, and Moadim L'Simcha. Welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's having a Zissin Pesach. Uh, you're pretty close to exhausting my Yiddish response, but my Yiddish knowledge with that. But hope everybody's doing well and feeling good. As we're coming up on chapter 16 in a God of Becoming in Relationship. So we'll on ever dying, never dead, and our and mortality. Um, It was. I'll admit it was some good reading as I was preparing Yisker sermons this week. But as always, I want to open it up for any comments, thoughts, questions, reactions to start us off before we dive in to the material.
With the Yizker connection, do our relatives who have passed away ever become angels? Or like all of mine do and none of Diane's do, or the other way around, something like that.
What did Diane do to not get it? No, I think typically my understanding of angelology, at least, is largely that angels are divinely created. There are couple different kinds and classes of angels along the way, but that generally there's one possible exception, but generally people do not become angels afterwards, unless you want to take the interpretation of angels as people who come along in our lives to guide us down the path that God wants us to, which doesn't quite seem quite what he's telling us. What Rabbi Artson is saying here, at least not. I don't recall him bringing up angels, but unless you want to take up the interpretation that angels don't actually exist but are just humans guiding us on the right path.
Well, in other religions, people pass away, and particularly children, they become angels.
Yeah, that's generally not the Jewish interpretation.
Why does God discriminate against Jews?
I don't think God's discriminating against Jews. I think it's just a different interpretation of the way God is acting in the world.
That's almost exactly what I would have said, but
So, relative to the Yizkor service, this is a Judaic practice that we have. So do other religions emphasize in their daily prayers and their major holidays remembering those who have passed?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert on other religions. I did take and TA a world religions class when I was in undergraduate. But I think culturally there are some traditions and some cultures that highlight and remember the dead more than others do. I think that's kind of a broad way to say it. Um, I think there's some Asian cultures and some Hispanic cultures that are very dedicated to keeping the memory of deceased loved ones in frequent accessibility, I guess. But I don't know if I can speak too intelligently beyond that.
But you will admit that it's a huge thing in Judaism. I mean, you can virtually not have a service without having Kaddish being said. So, and this entire chapter here to me is all about that, which brings up the question to me is, we discussed reincarnation in the past. I can't remember. I'd like you to remind me what we decided on that. But it's in this chapter, there's confusing things to me, trying to understand it, unless you believe in reincarnation, that you actually, there is something between this life and going to the next life and then coming back, etc. But otherwise, I found that some of what he was writing confusing.
Okay. Well, so we'll try to come back and explain some of that down the line. I saw Barbara and Diane both had their hands up while I was talking. Then we'll go, at least on my screen, we'll work our way across because Lisa's right at the end of that screen.
I just was going to mention, and you kind of got to it, the other cultures that do, and Day of the Dead, that kind of thing for the Hispanic populations. But in the American South, I think that Decoration Day, or what we call Memorial Day, is much like that, because my Christian neighbors and friends always go to the cemeteries, clean up the graves, put out fresh flowers, and that kind of thing. So that may be a Southern habit, but certainly, and I guess the people I'm thinking of are all Methodist, but it's a Christian habit certainly in the South to remember the dead in that way, or honor them in that way.
Diane, were you going to add on too?
A couple of thoughts regarding the question about what Christians do to memorialize their deceased. I have a friend who sadly lost a child and invited one of her Christian friends to come with her on the York site to the synagogue. And the reaction from the non-Jewish friend was, wow, this is so amazing. When we bury our dead, we never say their names again in the church service. This is such a beautiful thing. So even the memorial plaques that we have, that's not a particularly Christian practice. I mean, if you give a lot of money, which a memorial plaque is costly, but just typically speaking, that you don't see the type of memorial plaques, and it's a huge deal. I mean, I know at one point we had some people at Bethel who went to look at the KI building, and they said it would be too costly to move. Just the cost of moving the memorial, we couldn't move without our memorial plaques, and the cost of moving those across town and reinstalling them would be prohibitive. On that basis alone, they didn't pursue. So I don't really put a lot of stock in that myself, but for some people it is really important. If you walk across the back of our sanctuary and you see those names, you'll see names of people that you know, whose families you don't ever see in synagogue, but they put up a memorial plaque. So for us, I think it is a very different experience. But the interesting thing to me about this chapter was when I read the part about the pearl and how people are always with you by the way that you live and practice, that I could follow and agree with, except I think if someone is in your life daily, a business partner, God forbid, a child or a spouse, they're not, you miss their presence. Last night I wasn't feeling well. I said, Howard, I've got a headache. I never get a headache. The last time I had a headache, I had COVID. Go find the COVID test. If he wasn't here to go find those COVID tests, it wouldn't be a lost pearl. It would be a genuine loss. So I think it depends on your life and where you are in those relationships as to how you experience that loss.
Lisa?
So at the last chapter, I indicated that I was kind of interested in knowing Rabbi Artson's take on what happens after we die, because it's something I grapple with. And I really found that he didn't answer this for me. that he really talked more about how to live knowing that we are going to die, that we are always dying, like such as the Messiah is always coming and we are always dying. So I appreciated what he had to say, but it didn't totally answer what I was looking for.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of you as I was reviewing the chapter, and like I was hoping he was going to tackle that, and then I'm like, oh, Lisa's going to be disappointed when I got to the end of the chapter. So we might have to go back to a previous chapter to reflect on some of that, and if we have some time later on, we'll try to go back to the chapter earlier in the book to circle back to it. So let's kind of work our way through and kind of talk about or think about where he's coming from and how this is tying in to Jewish life in a process kind of way. So what I'm trying to think of a good way to start us off here. I'm trying to remember if it was in this and I just didn't underline it, or if I was reading it somewhere else. But that we look at birth as some kind of great miracle of life. That this process of that there's something holy and miraculous about creating a new life and bringing it into this world. We usually don't think of it in the same way with death, though I think in some ways he's arguing that there's a parallel process going on here too. Is that in some way the body, rather than bringing the body into this world, we're bringing the body out of this world and the spirit into a new world beyond it. And a lot of the focus on this chapter, I think somebody said, is a lot on how do we live. When a friend, particularly a friend about our age, dies, it drives home the idea and the concept that we are in fact not going to live forever. And there is something kind of terrifying for us humans about that idea. That we have a limited time on this planet, in this world, and so much we haven't yet achieved, and so much that we will not be achieved when, as much as we would like, when the time comes for us to cross over. I think what he's trying to give us here is this idea that we don't have to think of it quite as terrifying as we do, but that it's all part of the same process along the way. That this says, mortality is the gift the living give to the future. That the wonder of life is that it renews itself constantly by sloughing off the old and embracing the new. That we're not going to live forever, but that's just part of the process of life and part of the world also. It doesn't, that it's emotionally, yes, it's hard, but that it's part of the process along the way. So what do we do with that? What do we do knowing that the old breaks down along the way and some of the relationships and connections feel severed? And I think his argument is that those relationships and connections aren't severed, but that they continue on beyond the physical manifestation of that relationship. So he looks at a couple different ways of doing it. Is that he talks about Yisker as a time of or Yom Kippur in particular as a time of reflecting that we only have a limited number of times that we're going to get together to say these prayers together. I think Rabbi Ed Feinstein has a nice drash on Unatana Tokef of, when you look around the room on Yom Kippur, you realize that the chances that every single person is going to be standing next to you in the same place next Yom Kippur is probably not good. And what some of the Yom Kippur tries to get us to understand is, we always look around and be like, oh, who could it be? And what Yom Kippur tries to say is, well, it could be you. And if that is, if this was the last year of your life, how are you going to try to live it? And Rabbi Artson says something similar, that we have a limited number of times when we will gather together to recite those prayers, and we are conscious that the clocks of our lives are ticking. So what do we do with that? We have a couple of different approaches we can take. One is we can freak out. We can make laundry lists of all the things we have yet to accomplish that we still want to do, and all the things that we feel must be done before that time comes. We can wring our hands and wonder how we're going to get it all done. That's one possibility. What he argues for is that rather than making that list, it should cause us to refocus our priorities in our lives. What is actually important? What are the relationships that are really important? Who are the people that are important? And it causes us to refocus our lives in a different way, to focus on what actually should be important.
So, Rabbi, the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, to me, is all about who shall live and who shall die. I mean, you're focusing on who's going to die, or how are you going to die, or how are you going to die, al-Chait, etc. Pesach, to me, is not at all about that specifically. It's more about remembering the stories, telling the stories, remembering the people who are our leaders, past leaders in a story, and remembering, sort of in a parallel way, the people in your family who are not there at that at the Seder. Some of them were there last year and not here this year. So it's just a more joyous sort of feel. The other is who shall live and who shall die. That's a hard concept there.
Yeah, and I might phrase Passover in the context of this conversation. I might phrase Passover slightly differently. That we read in the Haggadah that if God had not brought us out of Egypt, then us and our children and our children's children would still be slaves in Egypt to this day. And we recognize that our existence and where we are at this moment, at this time, is a product of so much of our ancestors leading up to this moment. So how do we fill, so for us, it becomes, how do we fill our moments to leave the legacy we want to leave behind for our descendants? So that they will look back at us and think, what are the moments that brought us here, and who are the people who helped us come to this moment, and lead us to who we are and where we are right now, and what did they do to help us get there. Which is maybe a different reflection, but a similar concept of what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are asking also of who do you want to be and what's the story and the legacy you want to leave behind. Other thoughts, comments so far?
I really like what Stuart said about remembering, because that's one of the things that for me is a focus of Passover. And if you think about it, so many of our holidays, pre-Purim, etc., tell us, remember this, remember. So maybe we're not the people of the book as much as we are remembering what's in the book, to remember what's happened before us. And I think you take a good extension of that, Rabbi, when you say, remember what happened and what are you doing to give future generations something that they'll remember as a change.
Yeah, I'll say two things. Just first thing, just to add on to what you're saying, is even Shabbat is Zecher Litziat, part of Kiddush is Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim. That Shabbat is we're recalling the Exodus from Egypt. We're recalling creation. That there is even in a weekly holiday of Shabbat, we're calling back to those stories. The second thing I want to add before I call him Diane, is if you're ever interested in the Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, I think is his name. He has a book called Yisker. It's a lot of whys. If you haven't read it, it's a little on the philosophical side, but what he does, and it's interesting in that what he does is he talks about through different periods of history how memory is used. And he talks about in the biblical period, it's one way, in the rabbinic period, it's another, and in the modern period, it's yet a different way. And the way that we use memory and stories in our tradition has evolved over time. And it's been a while since I've read the book, so I can't recall exactly. But if you're ever interested, it's not a very long book. It's maybe 150 pages. It's not long, but it's an interesting take on history and how do we remember it. Diane, go ahead.
So the one perspective I got out of the chapter that I hadn't thought about previously is that you carry the influence of those you knew who came before you, whether you actively think about it or not. So just several years ago, it occurred to me, pretty soon there will not be anyone alive who actually remembers my father because he died so many years ago. But after I read this chapter, I said, oh, they'll remember him because he influenced me, and the things that I say and do will now be remembered by others. And that's how he lives on. And that was just something, a thought that had never occurred to me. But even more recently, we lost Marilyn Potts last week. And I think I knew her from the day she first practiced as a trainer. And at one point she was training me, and there's an exercise that I do that I now call my Marilyn exercise. It's one that I learned from her, and I still do many years later after no longer being trained. So I think that that was a big takeaway for me from this chapter, was that we do tell their story, whether we actively tell it or not, by the way that we live.
Good. So that's a good segue into the next section, is that he draws a parallel, one that I use kind of often, I think this section, this mini section here at the bottom of 136, and right before the value in always dying, has really shaped a lot of my views on the Messianic era. But it says, like, we're, as Jews, we pledge often for the coming of the Messiah. But if the Messiah is always coming, then the Messiah never actually arrives. Which is, an interesting way to think about it. And that our job is to prepare the world for the coming of the Messiah, knowing that the Messiah is not actually going to come, because if he's coming, then he can't actually arrive. He's always in the process of coming. And Rabbi Artson draws a parallel with our lives as well, that if we think of our lives, if we think of our lives in a way that we're dying but not yet dead, then, or dying but never dead, then we are able to live our lives in a way that, as Diane was saying, that we're influencing people that will carry on our memory beyond us. So that, generations from now, people might not remember my name, but they may still be using stories or lessons that they've learned from me in 100 years based on what I am doing today, in the way I'm living my life today. And that we carry with us throughout our lives, so that we remember what people would have said. We remember how people would have reacted. We kind of have this spiritual memory of people, even when they're no longer physically accessible. And that extends way beyond ourselves. And so he makes the argument of living our lives as a gift for God. And that's kind of his conclusion here, is that towards the end of the chapter, this time is no longer my time. It is my gift to God. And I will live my life in such a way that every moment is my gift to God. The way I treat people I love and those I do not love, I will offer up as a gift. The way I work to build community, I offer, God, this gift to you. And so that's what I think he's trying to argue for, is not seeing death as an end, and not seeing death as, death is a tragedy, but not seeing it as the end of life, but seeing it as a way to motivate us to live better in the future, so that our memories get carried on beyond. Thoughts, comments?
So I just wanted to say one thing to Lisa's question that he didn't really answer for her. So I remember going to Rabbi Culpepper having the same question: what happens? I think for most people, we have that question at the time of loss. When we lose someone, or when we know someone is not doing well, then what's going to happen to them? And she said to me, Diane, I have the same answer all the other rabbis give. No one's come back to tell us yet. So we just all have our own interpretation. But he didn't give you his interpretation. And I always come back to because where I grew up, there were so many people proselytizing me, and they were like, "Oh, well, you know what's going to happen if you don't have Jesus." And I said, you haven't been there. You can't tell me that for sure. And until somebody can come tell me, I can't really worry about it. Judaism teaches me that my job is here and now, not what's going to happen after I'm gone. I think that's, to me, one of the biggest attractions about the Jewish faith. We don't make up stuff just because it'll somebody will believe it.
So, I think on some level that's a good way to look. That's a good way to live your life. Is that you live your life not worried about what your afterlife is going to be. The Jewish tradition does have a lot about the afterlife. It talks about Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, as a kind of paradise, and it talks about Pardes, which is another term for paradise, and Gehenna, Gehinom, or Olam Haba, the world to come, or the Techiyat HaMetim, or Gilgul, which is more fun to say, the resurrection of the dead. Reincarnation is Gilgul. Gilgul HaNeshamot. Techiyat HaMetim is resurrection. Ket Hayamim, the end of days. There's a lot of conceptions about what the afterlife can be, exactly for why Diane said, because, nobody's come back to tell us what exactly it is. So it's hard to know for sure. There is a great sugya, I think I've shared with you guys before. There's a great section in the Talmud in which the rabbis debate whether or not the dead know what is happening in this world and whether or not they're aware. And there's one part of the conversation circles around, I think it's Shmuel, if I remember correctly, who, his father used to hide money in the house to give to orphans. And when his father passed away, nobody knew where the money was.
Yeah.
So Shmuel wanted to be able to distribute the money that his father had saved to give to those who needed it. So he goes to the cemetery, and a ghost comes out and says, who are you looking for? He goes, I'm looking for Abba. And the ghost says, well, we got a whole cemetery full of Abbas here. Like, you're going to need to be more specific. And he says, well, I'm looking for, my Abba. He's like, keep going. Like, we got Rabbi Abba. He's like, okay, there's a lot of Rabbi Abbas here. He's like, Rabbi Abba ben so-and-so. He's like, okay, now I know who to get you. And so he goes and comes back and, has a conversation with his deceased father about where the money is, and then asks him, what's going on up there while I'm there. So, you get stories like that along the way of whether or not the dead are aware of what's happening and what the afterlife looks like. But if you go back to chapter 7 in your books, it's a short chapter that we did a while back, in which Rabbi Artson doesn't give like a concrete, this is what it is, but does give some sense of a process concept that that essentially we reintegrate into the greater entity of God, and that our energy gets redistributed throughout the world, and we continue as patterns of God's energy along the way. So, toward the last couple paragraphs of the chapter, for those in the ebook, it's on the bottom of page 59 if you have the physical book. It said, one possibility is that death marks the end of our individual consciousness. Our energy patterns continue unabated, but there's no governing central organization, no self-reflective awareness that continues beyond death. We merge back into the oneness from which we emerged. So, in some sense, I think, our physical bodies go back to the world, our spiritual bodies get reintegrated into God, and we continue on, and our energy continues on that way. He offers a second possibility that our consciousness and identity continue unimpaired. As God is process, and as God is the one who is supremely connected, everything supremely related and forgetting nothing, we remain eternally alive in God's memory and God's thought, which it turns out is what we have been all along. So in that sense, if in some way that God is aware of our recollections, of our actions, and God is aware of our memory, and God integrates all of that, then when we die, all of that just gets reintegrated into God and continues on in the world based on that. That's kind of his conception of what happens in the afterlife. Whether or not it's satisfying is up to you, but that's kind of where I think that's seems to be along the lines of what we're saying also, is that we were saying earlier that, I might not be remembered in 100 years, but it's possible that the lessons I've taught to people might get passed down 100 years later. And in that way, I remain alive beyond the physical. Thoughts, comments?
Well, on
Yes.
the top of 136, there's mention of something that people who talk about how to live a happy life frequently say, and this is focus our attention on living and not on people we do not enjoy being with. So, I mean, that sounds a bit snobbish to me, but selfish. But I was going to ask you, Rabbi, in your profession, can you avoid being around people that you don't want to be around? Is that something a rabbi can do? How do you handle that?
I mean, to some extent, yes. I'll give you one example. It's an older example, but I'll give you one. When I went to a small private elementary and middle school growing up, and then so I think my graduating class was 27, maybe, from 8th grade. And then I went into a large public high school where my graduating class was 400. And I was one of 2 people from my middle school who went to that high school, whereas most of the people in that high school had all gone to middle school together, had all gone to elementary school together, all knew each other for a long time and grew up together. So they all knew each other. And so, I kept in touch with a lot of my middle school friends, especially the first year or 2 of high school. And there's one I remember distinctly, a girl who, we would just talk on the phone. She was a nice girl. We'd talk, we'd catch up periodically. But there were, it got to a point where, I one of us would call the other, we'd be talking, and hey, how's it going? And she'd say, how's it going? I'd be things are good. It's, this is going on, this is going on. I'm how are you doing? And then she would just go. And I would be uh-huh, yep, okay, uh-huh. And if I didn't talk for long enough, she'd go, are you still listening? I'm uh-huh, yeah, I'm still here. And we might talk for an hour, and about 50 minutes of it would be her talking in that. And at some point after this went on for a while, I'm I'm not sure I'm getting so much out of this relationship, right? I'm not really getting much other than listening to her ranting about things. And so, at some point I just stopped calling her because I'm I'm not really getting anything out of this. So, I mean, I think that we do all have those kinds of relationships where, we step back for a moment and say, I'm not sure this is really a good relationship, or I'm not sure I'm really getting anything out of this relationship, or, looking back, I don't really like this person, as much as I thought I did. And I think what Rabbi Artson's arguing here is, that's okay. Like, you don't have to like everybody, and you don't have to spend your time with those people if you don't like them. And if you're really assessing your priorities in your life, then go for that. Like, don't do that. Um, I don't, Rabbi Artson is not ignorant. He was one of the first people who said, if you're going to go into the pulpit, there's always going to be somebody in your congregation who's going to drive you up the wall. Every congregation has that one member. So I mean, he knows that, and he knows that you have to deal with them. His advice, by the way, if any of you need help in your lives, his advice for that is always ask, what does their mother love about that person?
What is their what?
What does their mother love about them?
Oh,
Like, if you have that one person who's driving you nuts, step back and think to yourself, why does their mother love them?
What is it?
Because every mother loves their child. So if you can step back when you're getting annoyed at somebody and step back and think, what would their mother, what is it their mother love about them? Then you can go back to seeing them as a person who is loved and deserving of love, and you can deal with them in a kind, compassionate way. That was his general advice. My point is, he knows that in a professional capacity, you can't always just step away and cut out those people from your lives. But you can in some situations. Cindy.
I see what Stuart is saying, but I like to see that that part of the sentence in a different way is, it's not necessarily wasting time on people we don't enjoy being with, but it's also a means of self-preservation. And, even though we are protecting the self, and even though somebody might, the relationship is unhealthy, I mean, I think if we apply the idea, what we've learned here about process and the spark of the divine is that we all, it's sort of like what Rabbi Artson said, laughably, what does the mother love about him? But like, if we remember that everybody deserves kindness, and limiting contact with somebody for self-preservation is not mean, as long as you still treat that person in a godlike way. But sometimes it's still just the right thing to do.
Yeah, he does go on and say, we are all under the same sentence. Like, the verdict ends up being the same for everybody at some point. So it ought to be easier to forgive each other, because, what's the point in holding on to grudges if we're all going to end up in the same place anyway? And yes, I do think Rabbi Artson would make that argument as well, Cindy, that, part of our job, actually, I'll even take a step back, that if we see God as the one infused into every part of reality, then every person that we encounter is a reflection of the divine, or has a piece of the divine in them, and we need to treat them as such. Yes. That doesn't mean we always need to like them. It just means we need to treat them as such.
So I'm talking way too much today, but so our elder son took a course in college called Jewish Ethics. He was when he was at Emory, and when he got through, I guess he brought his notebook home, and I found it one day, and I remember on the first page it said, "You're not obligated to like everyone." But in addition to what Cindy said, the other piece of that, I think that people sometimes lose, is you're not allowed to talk against a group of people. Like, I mean, we all have groups we don't particularly want to hang out with a lot, but you can't say all of those who voted for such and such are people I have nothing in common with, and I can't be in the same room with them. That's against Jewish teaching. That's a really hard one that we're coping with it at this time in history. It's who can you not be around?
Yes, it's important to see the individual as an individual, not as a microcosm of a larger group. I think we may have talked a little bit about it, that there was a resetting the table group that event that happened a couple weeks ago, and that's one of the conversations that they had in that group of how do you talk across differences. Well, part of the way you talk across differences is you get to know the individual with whom you're speaking as an individual and who they are and what is important to them. And then you can kind of work to understand where they're coming from. But, if you walk in saying like, oh, you must be one of those kinds of people, then, it's really hard to get engaged in any real meaningful dialogue. But if you learn about the individual, you can get to actually understand a lot more about who they are and why they are coming to the conclusions that they are coming to. Even if you vehemently disagree with them, you at least come back to an understanding of why they came to the conclusions they did. I actually had this. There was a dinner we had a while back with a group with some members of the Southern Baptist community, and I was talking with one of them about a bill that's coming up in that's in the Alabama State Legislature about requiring prayer in schools. And he said, I'm a firm believer in freedom of religion. Like, you're free to believe whatever religion you want. And I said, well, if you believe that, like, how are you okay with prayer in schools? He's like, because I believe in freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. Like, everybody should have some kind of faith and belief. And, we should be encouraging that in our school system. And we should be having this conversation. And I'm like, well, what about somebody who doesn't have any faith? He's like, well, then they're welcome to sit in a corner and do whatever they want to do, like whatever spiritually feeds them, and read a book if they want, like whatever they need to do for that same kind of spiritual momentum. And so I'm telling you this not because I agree with him, but because we actually got in a one-on-one conversation, because neither of us jumped down the other one. We were able to say, like, I see where you're coming from. I was able to say, I'm not convinced in the current environment and the majority culture that it's going to be respectful towards all religions. He's like, yeah, I can see that. But, I think it's our obligation to make sure that all religions are, if we're saying we're going to require prayer, which is fine, then all religions should have a place to do that. So if we need to have one room reserved for the Hindus and one for the Buddhists and one for the Jews and one for the Catholics, there's nothing wrong with doing that if we want to do that. So, we got into an interesting conversation, which went a lot further than I think it would have if I said, oh, you're one of those people who wants prayer in schools. So having that personal conversation and approaching it from a place of curiosity and not generalizing from who people are, you can get a lot more understanding and dialogue across differences than you could otherwise. Neither of us convinced the other that we were right. But we both came away with an understanding of why we oppose or support that concept.
So,
yes, Lisa.
Well, just on the topic of how we want to be remembered, and who is remembered and how we want to be remembered, and Passover. I did hear this commentary about Passover that said not all the Jews left Egypt. Some of them remained behind in slavery because they didn't want to leave. But the ones we remember are the ones who were bold and courageous and, stepped forth towards freedom and a new life. And so I guess to me that invites us to be, it doesn't mean that we didn't say anything bad about those people that stayed behind. We just we don't particularly remember them. And so it invites us to be the kind of, how do we want to be remembered? And to have those qualities that we want to be remembered by.
Yeah, I've given that Josh once before. I had a different spin on it. I didn't give it here. I've been kind of like, one of these days I'm going to give that again here because I think it's an important Josh. That yes, not all of the Israelites left Egypt, but you bring up a good point that we, not all of them left, but we only remember those who did. And if I remember, I'd have to go back and look at it again. But I think my thesis in that Josh was, we only remember those who were courageous enough to take the steps into the unknown, and those who were too afraid of what might be, we never, those are the ones we forget and didn't change because they were afraid of what the future might hold. Those are the ones we don't remember. Barbara.
We don't have good archaeologic information about the Exodus. Do we have viable archaeologic information about those that stayed? Or did we make that up? Just because it's logical.
I do not think we have good archaeological evidence of any of it. That doesn't mean, this gets into a different conversation I think we've talked about before of the scientific, whether or not we value the Exodus because of its scientific proof, which I'm of the belief that, we don't really need scientific evidence for something to be true. So, we have scientific evidence of the Exodus. We don't have scientific evidence of the Exodus. Doesn't mean the story is any less true for what the Torah is trying to teach us. The Torah is not a history book. So, it's not trying to teach us accurate scientific history. It's trying to teach us how we're supposed to live our lives. And in that sense, it's true in the sense of what it's trying to achieve.
Whether it's in this class or others, yes, I understand that the Torah is not a history text. I was just looking to continue Lisa's discussion of, did we have evidence of remaining in Egypt, which I'm certainly not aware of, and I'm not surprised that there isn't any. And it comes down to something that I think seems logical, because we know people, free will people, are going to make choices. This is fine for me to do. There were people who didn't leave during the Holocaust or during those years because it didn't work for them. So it's not a surprise that people stayed. And I'm not arguing against people staying. It's just that, as Lisa said, we simply don't remember them because they're not the ones that did what our story wants to teach us.
Exactly. Yes. I don't think we have evidence for either one. No.
Well, science just hasn't found it yet.
Yes, Stuart.
Well, if you want to have a modern parallel of what I think, to an extent, you're talking about, is the African-American Great Migration. I mean, for forever, once blacks came and became slaves, they lived in many of the southern cities, others, but still in the southern cities. And then probably in the 30s and 40s, they began to move and they moved to northern cities, western cities. And then now, in more recent times, there's a reverse migration going on. The people are going back, and there's good documentation of this. And I think there's good documentation of a lot of the reasons why people left and why people came back. You could at least, if you understand that, you can maybe understand the process of what happened in the Jewish thing. Because even though, Barbara, some of the Jews stayed in Egypt. How long did they stay in Egypt? I mean, I don't know. I think once the Israelites achieved Palestine to live there, they might have said, "Hey, that sounds like a pretty good place. Let's go." So anyway, there's a good modern parallel to thinking about it.
It's an interesting parallel. It's a time of history I'm not super well, or a section of history I'm not super well versed on. So, but it would be interesting to learn more.
Yeah, there's a good book written about that. I think I've won a book or something. The Great Migration.
Stuart, I have no problem believing in the Great Migration. I mean, we know people in the town I grew up who came from southern cities, or their families came from southern cities when they were children. And then, I knew them as adults and grandparents and everything. And I think it's a good example of the fact that some people aren't able to leave, others are. And we know of the ones who leave because their stories are out there. And in this case, it's in the newspapers, it's in the everything, and currently in the books. So yeah, it's a big part of Black history.
That seems like a good note to end on. So, kol hakavod, everyone. Thank you for learning together. As a reminder, we're coming up at the end. We probably have 3 sessions left in this book. So if you can get me, if you have not already sent it, if you have any suggestions or things you would like to learn, send it to me, and we'll put it out to a vote in probably about 2 weeks, and we'll go from there. So in the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your Pesach, and as somebody said recently, wishing Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and don't let the Kasher get in the way of the Sameach. So wishing everybody a good rest of your Passover, and I hope to see you on Shabbat, and if not, hope to see you next week. Be well, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.